One thing do I teach, O my disciples, suffering and deliverance from suffering. It was in this way that Gautama the Buddha, living in the 6th century BC, gave the gist of his whole teaching. And it's for this reason that many commentators and critics of Buddhism have called it a way of escape because of its tremendous concern with the problem of human pain as the fundamental problem of life and the means of deliverance from pain. But I believe this is really a very mistaken criticism, because there is nothing that is so much the very essence of suffering as the fear of suffering itself. And if the doctrine of the Buddha were fundamentally based on an obsession to get rid of suffering, it would be a kind of self-contradictory vicious circle. This is very well illustrated by another of those stories which I tell from time to time, where a student came to his master with the question, "It is terribly hot, and how shall we escape the heat?" In other words, this was a symbolic question, asking about the whole problem of the heat of suffering. It is terribly hot, and how shall we escape the heat? And he answered, "Go right down to the bottom of the furnace." "But in the furnace," said the student, "how do we escape the scorching fire?" And the master's final word was, "No further pains will harass you." Now you might say then that the attitude of the Buddhist philosophy to suffering is not at all one of turning away from it, of solving the problem of suffering by turning one's back on it and escaping it. Rather, its whole attitude is that the solution to the problem of human pain, whether it be physical or whether it be moral, is to go right into it. Now, in the Buddha's doctrine, pain or suffering in its most general sense is designated by this word dukkha in Sanskrit. Dukkha is the opposite of sukha. And if you break the word down, du here means what is disagreeable, painful, bitter, and ka means condition. Su means what is sweet. So you might say this is bitterness in contrast with sweetness. And the first proposition of the Buddha's teaching, what is called the first of the Four Noble Truths, is the idea that life as we live it is fundamentally dukkha, fundamentally a kind of chronic frustration. And man's effort is always to get rid of this and go to that. But the basic idea of the Buddha was that if you have this, you must have this because these two contrast with each other. You don't experience this unless you experience this. You don't experience this unless you experience this. So if you go after sweetness, you cannot experience sweetness unless there is always at its background the contrast of bitterness. And therefore, the objective of the Buddha's doctrine was not to get rid of pain and put pleasure in its place, but to go to something else which stands, as it were, transcending these two opposites, above and beyond them, which in Sanskrit is called ananda. That word is usually translated bliss, but in a rather unusual sense. There is a poem, again from the tradition of Chinese Zen, which says, "Under the sword lifted high, there is hell making you tremble. But go straight ahead, and there is the land of bliss." And so bliss here has a very special meaning. It isn't bliss in contrast to agony. And I think probably the best way of translating the word ananda is to use the English word ecstasy. Now, then our problem is simply this. How is it that through a profound going into suffering, that is to say, a profound acceptance of it, there can come out of it some sort of bliss.